Welcome to Rewatch and Rank. On this channel, we rewatch older TV shows, provide a summary and opinion on the episode before ranking each episode against each other. Today's episode is Hannibal, Season 1, Episode 6, Entree. The episode in a nutshell is just a brief summary of exactly what happens within this episode. Abel commits a replica or copycat murder of the Chesapeake Ripper due to Dr. Chilton's unethical therapy while he's been incarcerated in an criminally insane asylum. Jack deals with Bella's diagnosis and coming to terms with the possibility of his spouse dying, while in flashbacks, Miriam works on the Chesapeake Ripper case and had disappeared in the past. However, as the episode progresses, evidence of life is found in the present that Miriam may not have died as previously believed. All right, so now that I've rewatched the episode, I am going to rank the episode on our two ranking lists. As a reminder, we rank on a mostly objective ranking list, which we do based on values on a chart, which is why it's mostly objective, though my judgment and bias on what applies on the chart still applies. And also the personal rankings, which of course is just my opinion on the episode overall. All right, so on the screen, you'll see the mostly objective rank values, and I've highlighted those that apply. To start with the positives about this episode, we have the introduction of several characters who are going to recur throughout the series and across multiple seasons. The first introduced character is Abel Gideon, who is currently held in the I believe it's the Baltimore Institute for the Criminally Insane. It's a prison and a psychiatric facility, and he is there due to having killed his wife and her family at a Thanksgiving approximately 2 years previous. Coincidentally, approximately 2 years previous is when the Chesapeake Ripper had last stopped killing, and at the start of the episode, Abel kills a nurse, replicating the way that the Ripper killed his last official victim. Frederick Chilton is the second character that we get introduced to that is going to recur, and he works at the psychiatric facility, and he is the lead therapist there who has had sessions with Abel Gideon and is the person who first started to suspect he may be the Ripper, and as we later find out in the episode, may have also been the reason that he thinks he's the Ripper, because we as the audience are aware that it is in fact Hannibal who is the Ripper, and so obviously something has happened. With Abel Gideon, Frederick also shows a undue interest in Will, due to his, of course, various neuroses and empathy disorders, etc., etc. And then the final character that we're introduced to that is a multi-season supporting character is Miriam Lass. Miriam Lass, of course, is a person that is only seen in flashbacks in this episode, but was a former student at the FBI Academy who was brought in to investigate the Ripper case during the investigation of his last official victim, and is the unofficial last victim of the Ripper, as everyone believes her to be dead at this point. And she, much like Will, kind of made those intuitive leaps and was very skilled and talented in crime solving, making those leaps that other people maybe didn't understand, which is what led to her ending up in the situation that she did. Each of these characters' introductions are worth 3 points each, and so we have 9 points so far. We then also get character development for these multi-season supporting characters. We get a little bit of development with Frederick in that it is shown that he has dinner with Hannibal in Atlanta, that he is referred to as an old friend, and Hannibal kind of commiserates on the well, not commiserates, I don't think that's the right word, but he kind of gives a welcome ear to his, like, if Frederick wanted to talk about how he was psychically driving Abel and was maybe unethical in his treatments, Hannibal will understand. So he can come and talk to Hannibal about it if he ever wants to have a willing ear to listen to what he did, essentially. And then, of course, the main development that we get is through Miriam, and again, how she was very intelligent. We get a rundown of her credentials when she's brought onto the task force. We then get some of her analytic crime scene mind when she visits the crime scene with Jack and gives him a report on what she sees from it. And then she writes a report to Jack asking him to basically for permission to investigate surgeons who were related to the wound, like who had treated some of the victims as kind of a long shot. But Jack then tells her that, oh, we can't get a warrant for that. We don't have enough information. But if it's a trainee just poking around and not an actual FBI agent, hint, hint, wink, wink. And then we see her, of course, going to Hannibal. And there she puts the pieces together that everyone so far in the series has missed. And we see her being choked out by Hannibal, rendered unconscious by Hannibal at that point. So we get more of, like, we get to know her credentials, a bit of her personality, a bit of her skill as an investigator. We also develop Jack a little bit more because he is coping with the loss of his wife's potentially, and that's kind of parallel to having lost Miriam as he feels responsible for that, and it kind of goes back and forth between those two types of grief that he experiences and how he's experiencing them. And that, of course, as development is worth 3 points as well, which brings us up to 12 points so far. We then go into the more negative side of the chart, and we get a negative with Miriam. There's negative messaging and behavior. And Miriam being sent off by Jack in order to get around the ethics. So, as I mentioned previously, she submitted a report stating that their next steps in the investigation should be to investigate surgeons who had treated or been related to some of the victims, as it is like they had already decided that the Ripper likely was in the medical field, and that might be able to help them to find out who the Ripper is. But due to the way the bureaucracy works, the paperwork needed, Jack says that there's no way they could get a warrant for that. Miriam, of course, is disappointed that her idea isn't going to be able to pan out. But as she is leaving, Jack kind of calls her back and makes the point of what a trainee can do versus, because they're not an official agent, versus what an actual FBI agent could do. And she makes the connections about it's better for a trainee to ask forgiveness than an FBI agent to ask permission, is how she puts it. Obviously, not only is that unethical that you're going basically trying to get around the law and the rules and the procedures to find the evidence that you're looking for, but then you also, this is directly related to her disappearance because of that unethical behavior. And so I think that's a negative message. Then you also, of course, have Chilton's unethical psychic driving, which is being discovered through Alana's talks with Gideon. Will also speaks with Gideon, and he brings up to Jack how he can see Abel as the Ripper, but he doesn't feel like the Ripper, which is why he brings up the point that it was likely plagiarized in the first place. And then Alana starts to figure out that potentially Gideon doesn't know that he's not the Ripper because he's been psychologically manipulated into believing he is the Ripper. And this, of course, most likely would be done by Chilton, as he's the main person that Gideon's been interacting with, and he's the person who first suspected he was the Ripper. but Chilton doesn't confess, though Hannibal, of course, gives him the opening and opportunity to do so in the future. So that is a -2 points, which brings us to a 10 for the mostly objective ranking, but also weak or dislikable character introduction. Now, I usually say this is not for characters that are meant to be weak or dislikable. For example, Hannibal, when you watch the show, you know he's a serial killer, so his dislikable behaviors not going to fall under this. However, Chilton is not really meant to be the villain. He's just an unethical, narcissistic douchebag, essentially, and that is how he comes off, and therefore is extremely dislikable. He also has a little bit of an undue fascination with Will, which is not something that we enjoy seeing either. He's just like not a character that's compelling to watch, and you're kind of not upset when bad things happen to him in the future. As this is a rewatch channel, I would assume you would probably know what happens in the future. And we'll talk about it more when we get to those episodes. But ultimately, he's a very dislikable character, and that's always worth a negative points, and that is worth a -4 points according to the chart, which then brings this episode overall to a 6 out of 10 mostly objective ranking. So with the ranking of 6 out of 10, our mostly objective ranking list so far is now Aperitif in first place, Souffle in second place, amuse-bouche in third place, potage in fourth place, entree comes in at fifth place, and then the sixth place is coquelle. So now we come to the part where it's my personal ranking, which is based solely on my opinion. So some things that stood out to me in this episode, of course, was the way that Will was able to intuit that the murder was plagiarized from the start with Abel. And while people aren't really sure at first, obviously he is later proven correct when we have Alana figuring out potential psychic driving, and then we also have basically Hannibal. When Jack disbelieves Will kind of backs off, doesn't really stand up for his opinion in this case, but he does note to Jack that if that Ripper was being plagiarized, the real Ripper for sure is going to let them know. He then is proved correct when suddenly Jack starts getting all of these voice messages from Miriam. The first one calls his house at 2 a.m. and is unable to be traced. Then he gets another one the next scene. I don't know if that's the next day or if some more time than that had passed. But either way, when he's at the FBI at Quantico, he gets another call which originates from his home, and he first answers it assuming that it's his wife on work, commenting that she had returned early, but in fact, again, the message plays. They then go to his house, and the fingerprints that are found on the phone belong to Miriam, and they find Miriam's hair on his pillow. Or is it his wife's pillow? On one of the pillows on the bed. And then when he gets another voice message playing, they then trace the number to an observatory. And when they arrive at the observatory, he calls the number back and they hear the phone ringing from inside, which I want to call out. That's pretty good imagery as well, because this show is very good at that kind of imagery. And when they go inside, they find a fresh arm at the observatory, which is assumed to be Miriam's. Obviously, there's also a negative in that Jack comes to basically try to provoke the Ripper, which is what leads to the arm being found and everything, by getting Freddie Lowndes to confirm Abel as the Ripper in the episode. And he comes to Will seemingly to ask his advice on that or get his agreement for it, but then he doesn't actually listen to anything that Will says, which is one of the more dislikable characteristics of Jack as a character. and I wanted to shout that out. We then, of course, have the Lowndes, Freddie Lowndes and Will. They're so hostile to each other, and I understand Will's side of it, but I still don't know what made her hate Will so much because they've had very few interactions, and she hated him before she even met him. So I'm still confused about that, and I always want to call that out because it's not, I don't think it ever really gets fully explained properly why she hates Will so much and why she hated him without ever meeting him. We also then have the fact that Hannibal allows himself to be provoked by somebody else claiming to be the Ripper. And just with Hannibal's overall calmness and meticulousness, it's odd to me that he's so provoked by some random in there. And in fact, like, I would think that would be advantageous to have them think somebody else was you. You know, he doesn't really kill in the same way twice. It kind of puts heat off because even if he does start killing again, they'll think it's a different serial killer. So he's not going to have that history. He might be able to more easily get away with it for a little bit longer. But I also know that he is a person of pride. And so he doesn't like the fact that someone's claiming his work. And at least when he is provoked, unlike characters from other certain shows that we review on this channel, he at least is very careful about how he goes about revealing himself, and he reveals, of course, that through Miriam. And as we are rewatching, we do know the future, but it is astonishing me, like, where has he kept? I know it'll be revealed eventually, but the fact that Miriam is still alive 2 years later, I'm very curious. I know we get kind of like where she was held and some little snippets in the future, but we don't really get like what was her daily life like for 2 years, having been kidnapped by the Ripper, by Hannibal. Where was he keeping her? What was her life like? We never really get to know that, but I am very curious. I wish there was kind of like a short story or something that was like companion to the novels or the TV series that kind of gave that information because I really would like to know. And then, of course, there's just the general Hannibal with his dinner, the featured episode, him his once again highlighting how dangerous he is in that he is open to Chilton using unethical psychic practices and is empathizing with him on that, and also on how easily he was able to sneak up on and overpower Miriam when she found the picture that he drew and carelessly left on the table, which is not like Hannibal. But then would he have anticipated her coming? But I just always feel like he's so meticulous, he's so careful, pre-planning things, that for him to get caught up based on a picture that he carelessly drew of his own murder and left out on a table, um, not really a good look for his character. Obviously, the murder that they're replicating is just a bunch of items sticking out of a body. It's not like they've done some pretty great imagery with the way that bodies are displayed, the way that people have killed. It's just a bit of a lackluster way as compared to some of the others we've seen. So I'd rate it only like a so-so. And then, of course, there is the imagery of like the hand holding the old model cell phone, which is Miriam's hand, found in the observatory with the phone ringing. I liked that imagery. And also we got the feathered stag, which is always nice. I also appreciate the fact that Miriam managed to do what no one else in the series has so far, and that is that she found Hannibal and she was able to peg him as the Ripper. Essentially, she found him out. Will, for all his empathy, has a big blind spot already where it concerns Hannibal, hasn't put those pieces together despite his own intuitive leaps. Obviously, Jax doesn't suspect, Alana doesn't suspect, nobody else suspects Hannibal, but she found him, and I think that shows and highlights her skill, makes her a very likable character, as it shows her as a competent character, which personally, I will always prefer a competent character over an incompetent one, like Chilton. And so, while there's a mix of negatives and positives, overall, I found that my enjoyment level of the episode was really high. I liked the introduction of new characters. That was very refreshing after getting kind of bogged down in the whole Abigail nonsense for the first few episodes and then kind of murders that are unrelated to Hannibal. This was kind of bringing it back to more Chesapeake Ripper, which we know is Hannibal, introducing new characters, and characters that we like, that we have a history with, at least with Miriam and Jack they do. But again, it was Will Light. So I ranked it an 8 out of 10 overall, which brings it actually to the top of my personal ranking list. This is my favorite episode so far for this series. So we start Entree in first spot, Amuse-Bouche is second, Aperitif was in third place, Souffle in fourth, Coquelle in fifth, and then Potage was my least favorite so far in sixth place. Which brings us to the end of the video and the final ranking, which in this series we are also ranking not just each episode of a season against each other, but also each season against the other seasons. And so because season 1 has 13 episodes, it gets a maximum total possible score of 130. And this episode we have mostly objective at 6, which brings us up to 47 out of 130 for the season so far. And on the personal side, we've added 8 for a total of 34 out of 130. Once we've finished the season, we'll then know the final score for that season, and we will calculate a percentage based on that. And once we have all of the seasons watched, based on the percentages that we get, we will know which seasons were better than the others. And with that, we've rewatched and ranked Hannibal Season 1, Episode 6, Entree. Like and subscribe if you'd like to, and I'll see you in the next episode.